I want to talk about Russia's response to what's going on right now in Iran. Now, we see that the American government and the Israeli government and the Iranian government might be agreeing to some ceasefire that proceeds over 24 hours. The first 12 hours, the Iranians are under ceasefire. Then the Israelis jump onto ceasefire after 12 hours. And then another 12 hours passes before a full ceasefire after the American strikes on Fordo, Nasfahan, and other atomic facilities led quite devastating damage. The scale of that damage is not readily known, but it certainly looks like it has set back the Iranian nuclear program, which was at least at 60% enrichment, which is well above the nuclear proliferation treaty standard set by international law, set by the Atomic Convention. And so after that, the Iranians struck Doha, struck the base there, and very minimal damage, no American casualties. It seemed like it could have been viewed as a face-saving strike. So what Putin could really even do at this late stage, you know, when it comes to sending of munitions and stuff, the most he could do when it comes to sending munitions now, if the ceasefire goes through, is to prepare the Iranians to rebuild and get back in the fighting order, get back into an order where they can really deter, and it's not just the Israelis basically pot-shotting from a distance with the odd Iranian missile getting through and causing quite the damage. And so at this stage, I don't really know what they could do, but they're also in a position where they can't really do much just due to what they're engaged in. I mean, the Iranians, they're in this back and forth struggle with the Israelis, but the Russian government has been engaged in a going on 4-year slog in Ukraine, losing hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of men, expending tons of missiles, tons of drones, losing tons of air defense systems, tons of armored vehicles, using basically the entirety of their artillery supply to the point where they have to be reliant on the North Korean artillery supply in order to keep their forces moving forward, and ever expanding investment into the drones that have now come to dominate the 21st century battlefield in Europe. So the Russians are in a position where, you know, the Iranians might need more S-300 and S-400 air defense systems because they need more long-range air defense systems after the Israelis took them out. But the Russians are not in a position defending the largest country on the planet from an ever-expanding Ukrainian drone threat to just, while they're losing air defense systems, to just send, you know, air defense systems to replace the ones that the Iranians lost. And so despite the fact that the Russians did sign a strategic partnership with the Iranians just a year ago, and they said that they would come to each other's defense within the bounds of the UN Charter, and, you know, they would, hurrah, hurrah, together we hold up against our enemies. That has really amounted to not a lot. I mean, yes, the Iranians had S-300s. Yes, the Iranians had S-400s. They had those weapon deals. But when it comes to what Russia is going to do for them in a pinch to either replenish that supply or to ship them new munitions or to send them really anything at all that is publicly documentable, they've completely come up short. And so everything I've seen from the Russians has been verbal. It has been comments on, you know, that the crime of aggression, the unprovoked aggression of the United States and Israel against Iran is so bad. And it's against the fundamental principles of the United Nations, in the UN Charter, and the crime of aggression. And I'm sure that verbal stuff is something nice to put on state TV and broadcast that to the public. Make a few Telegram posts that'll be spread around and, you know, make Iran not look like they're completely isolated. But having Russia come out in public and say, hey, everybody, we, Russia, believe that countries need to start following UN laws. And oh, the crime of aggression. What did Iran do? Well, Iran didn't stop the pursuance of an atomic weapon, and they got bombed. Ukraine gave up the pursuance of an atomic weapon, and they got invaded. So, I mean, I don't want to get into the itty bitty details about the differences here, but I think the difference is pretty clear. And Russia, of all countries, being one to come out and say, oh, the crime of aggression in the UN Charter, this carries no weight outside of those immediately in Iran's circle. The Belarus, North Korea, nation states that were already going to be predisposed towards being sympathetic towards the Iranian position. This is not Germany coming out and condemning it, which might, have some significance. The Germans have come out and said they specifically aren't condemning the strikes on Iran. This isn't Japan. This is just the Russians saying bad, and bad because of the rules that we ourselves do not abide by. So it's the worst possible representative of somebody to come out and say that's bad, coming out and saying that's bad. And this is Jeffrey Epstein coming out against diddling, R. Kelly coming out against being a sex pest, Diddy coming out against baby lotion. Like, Chris Brown Women's Rights Month. It doesn't match. It is the worst representative for this movement. Be like Dmitry Prigozhin coming out to represent the good treatment of prisoners, or it just doesn't match up. But still, let's read their strong statements. The absolutely unprovoked aggression against Iran has no basis and no justification, Putin said during his meeting on Monday. We had a long-standing, good, reliable relationship with Iran. Now, the only other avenue I've seen the Russians provide the Iranians is they offered to negotiate between Iran and the United States some solution, to be the intermediary, to perform this type of Oman role of being between point A and point B. And Trump responded to that with the first time I see Trump actually show any bit of a backbone, really, when it comes to the Russians, saying, how about you mediate your own war first? How about you bring peace to Ukraine before you bring peace to Iran? Was the general message that I got from Trump, which made sense. I don't know if that's something that was, got in his ear from Marco Rubio. I don't know if that's something that got into his ear from, some Fox News hosts, if that's something he came up with himself. But it's true. It makes sense. But again, there's no actions, no physical actions, no military reinforcement, no air defense reinforcement, no missile, no drone, no new technology sharing. We'll put a pin on that for a second. As far as we can know, there's no publicly documentable support outside of, this is risking global conflict. This is against the principles of the UN Charter. Hey, we would love to mediate peace. Russia and China have strongly condemned U.S. attacks on Iranian nuclear sites, warning they could drag the world into a broader war and set a dangerous international precedent. The reaction came just hours before Iran launched missiles at U.S. bases in Qatar on Monday. Russian President Vladimir Putin described the attacks as unjustified, American strikes on the atomic program, that is, and said they were pushing the world towards a perilous tipping point. A perilous tipping point. Now, outside of words, could there be anything else coming out here? Maybe long term, yes. Short term, unlikely. But I'll tell you the rumblings so we can put our ears to the train tracks a bit to figure out what the schedule is. So Dmitry Peskov, Putin's press secretary, was talking to TASS, which is one of Russia's state-owned news agencies, and they said, well, speaking to those that would be communicating to the Russian public. So this is Putin's spokesperson talking to a state outlet communicating to the Russian public. So understand the messaging profile here. This is not to an international audience. This is not to an Iranian audience. This is not directed towards a Western audience. This is directed towards a Russian audience. He says that Russia's ready to help Iran. Let me read you what they said that their help they offered is. Russian presidential spokesperson Dmitry Peskov told reporters at a briefing that assistance all depends on what Iran needs. Not all what it depends on, but let's keep reading. We have offered mediation, like we talked about before. This is concrete. I mean, it's concrete talks, but I mean, what did Trump say to those talks? Mediate your own wars. So, if you offer it, but Trump's not open to it, how much does that really, work? We have stated our position, which is also a very important form of support for the Iranian side. So the support that Peskov comments on, mediation, stating their position. So we offer to be the middleman between Trump and the Ayatollah, or we said that we support Iran publicly. So the world knows that Russia stands against unprovoked aggression. Anyway, going forward, everything will depend on what Iran needs at this moment. Well, what Iran needs at this moment is more S-300s and S-400s, something that Russia cannot provide. What Iran needs at this moment would maybe be a cut of Russian Shahed production so they could further saturate Israeli air defense systems. But both due to the fact that they have their own war and due to the fact that Russia has its own ongoing relationship with Israel, and the Ukrainians have been positioning for very long for the Israelis to assist Ukraine more in the war effort, and they're more in the Western bloc than they are with any other bloc. The Russians would have some motivations not to poke and prod the Israelis and indicate to them that they're going to benefit their long-term strategic opponents if they don't want to push the Israelis to support the Ukrainians. Then again, if the Russians can put the Israelis in a strong enough immediate security crisis, maybe they won't have the resources to do so. For example, supply for Patriot air defense systems. Either way, though, there is at least some diplomatic limitations that the Russians have to consider when interacting with the Israelis as well. And so for the immediate term, there's not really much Russia can offer. And I think Peskov is indicating that words and offered mediation, which as far as we know didn't come through, as the United States went on its own way to talk about this 12 to 24-hour ceasefire effort, multi-stage. But we do have one more message from the Russian side that I had to take apart, had to talk about, because it probably was the most interesting, and it comes from one of the more interesting Russian operators. Dmitry Medvedev. Now, if you're new to the channel, and if you don't know of Mighty Medvedev, well, let me tell you who this guy is. Medvedev is one of the few people from Putin's first presidential campaign, when he came into power at the turn of the century, turn of the 20th century. Medvedev is one of the few people from that campaign that's still in Trump's Freudian slip, in Putin's inner circle. If you go look at old campaign footage, you can basically list them as dead, dead, fled, fled, dead, fled, dead, fled, or Medvedev. Medvedev is one of the few who stuck around and has been able to maneuver in Putin's inner circle long enough to not only be Russian president during the interim when Putin was not president of Russia for some period, and had some Western liberals hoping and praying, wishing upon a star, that Medvedev would be the Russian liberal that delivers us from authoritarianism and revanchism, which obviously did not end up being the case, as now Medvedev is most known after, now being put to be Russia's head of their Security Council and moving around from other positions in Putin's inner circle, known as one of the chest-beating war hawks of the administration, who comes out to give one of the strongest, angriest positions from within the administration. And Medvedev is also has a kind of public rumor record of being kind of a drunkard. And so some of these tweets are viewed as the strong line position from within the administration, but also the position of a drunkard, further degrading its credibility. But I will say that some Russia watchers, and of course, this is kind of like, 3D, 5D, 6, 7D chess. At some point, you have to say, well, people are kind of flawed. Maybe you're thinking too deep into it. Some Russia watchers actually say that Medvedev's drunk routine is actually meant to make him look weaker near Putin and is therefore a political defense mechanism. But he could also just be a drunk, or it could also just be complete rumor. Who knows? Either way, let's read what he had to say about the recent strikes on Iran and potential Iranian support Russian support for Iran. What have the Americans accomplished with their nighttime strikes on 3 nuclear sites in Iran? Number 1, critical infrastructure of the nuclear fuel cycle appears to have been unaffected or sustained only minor damage. Now, if you read some Iranian press outlets, they say just the entrance and exit of these facilities were damaged. From the satellite photos I've seen on the Fordouz facility, I find that to be highly unlikely. That's not to say that everything has been destroyed. I think that the idea that they got scientists out in advance, despite earlier scientists being killed by the Israelis, that they got some material out there in advance, that stuff I can believe, but some material is not that easy to move, and the structure itself carries its own value, especially with it being quite defensible, buried in a mountain. While the other facilities, like those in Isfahan, just needed the 30 Tomahawk strikes, even though they actually say one of those facilities would have actually been in some of the best condition post-strikes. I find it very hard to believe that they only had minor damage. I do. That's not to say that they're completely destroyed, but I do believe the program was kicked down the road. Has it been permanently disabled? That's something that you can only guarantee with troops on the ground, with some form of ground confirmation, which I don't believe getting anytime soon. Number 2, the enrichment of nuclear material, and now we can say it outright, the future production of nuclear weapons will continue. Is this true? Maybe. I think that the production, or therefore the program itself, will continue. Whether or not they're going to pursue enriching material again in the near future, trying to get towards 60, 70, 80%, getting closer to the 90% they need, considering that can come with possibly an even harder American response that could see not just Israeli strikes across Iran and American strikes concentrated just at these facilities, but Israeli strikes across Iran and American strikes not only at these facilities, but more expansive across Iran. America participating in these strikes trying to kill scientists. America participating in the electrical infrastructure that would be necessary to power such an operation. America participating in strikes on other infrastructure or just general sections of Iranian society, not only to further cripple any any capacity to continue the program, cripple, not disable. Again, you need ground confirmation for that, but also other sections of Iranian society. Stuff that puts pressure on the regime more as a whole outside of the program. So the production could continue, the program could continue, but it's going to be slowed down, it's going to take time, and it's going to take a lot more investment, because to rebuild facilities, to have locations that are safe to work towards the building of atomic bomb, as well as the investment into the launcher program, getting the device by which to carry the bomb to its target. That's going to take more investment. That's going to take more time. And, whether or not it continues, I think is going to be dependent eventually. And this is going to be the hardest part for the Trump administration. And this is why I think this one holds the most truth. Some negotiation. The Trump administration, I think, is dead set against putting troops on the ground in Iran. They would much rather prefer the Iranian regime collapses. But that, as of right now, seems incredibly unlikely. Therefore, they're faced with the position of either bombing the nuclear program every few years to set it back, always with the possibility that they could still eventually achieve it if they can continue to funnel resources into it over enough time and continue rebuilding. And if they're determined enough, if they think it is essential enough for their security, if the Israelis have a nuke, they need to have a nuke. Then, yeah, they'll continue. And eventually, there's going to have to be some agreement, either with the fall of the regime and an agreement with the new power, or something that says, hey, maybe you can have civilian capacity, no military capacity, which is something the Israelis don't want to accept. And from what I read, the American government wanted more. Or whether or not the American government would demand something like an end to funding of the proxies, which is something Trump talked about back in 2015 and was a big critique from the right on the JCPOA. That means no funds to Hezbollah, no funds to Kataib Hezbollah, no fund to the Houthis. Whatever that would be, there would have to be some agreement to stop them to having a bomb, and that would mean likely the American government not getting everything it wants. And the question is, will Trump be willing to accept that? And would the Israelis not derail that? And number three, this is what caused the most stir, and I understand why it caused the most stir, and I understand why people are paying attention to it. A number of countries are ready to supply Iran with their own nuclear warheads. Let me read that again. A number of countries, this is from Dmitry Medvedev, a number of countries are ready to directly supply Iran with their own nuclear warheads. Well, then that would kind of move around the dilemma of the production and the research underground and trying to continue funding. Of course, if they got nuclear warheads, they would still want their own domestic weapons program to maintain it. But when it comes to racing towards an atomic warhead, if they could get the warhead, then the question would be the delivery system. And if the Russians are willing to do a certain amount of technology sharing and are willing to help them on that ground, that is something the Russians could help them with. The technology sharing, not only to forward their weapons program, but also forwarding their delivery system. But the skipping of the process of the Iranians having to go through their enriched material and to take together what, experts believe could be roughly like 10 atomic devices and put them together for those devices. If they could skip that, get the warhead, and then technology share into delivery system, then it's still going to take more time for, the Iranians to build up a domestically independent atomic program. But now they would have the big bomb. They certainly would have the big bomb, and then it would be a question of the delivery system. Now, look, this is not a foolproof plan. The Russians, of course, have the disincentive of pissing off Trump, and therefore he could maybe take a harshly different stance on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This, of course, comes with the risk of them being intercepted during the trade. This, of course, comes with the risk of them not giving delivery system, getting the atomic warhead, then the warheads getting destroyed in their country. This, of course, comes with the risk that if they give them 5 warheads and the American government learns about it and knows that they don't have a domestic atomic weapons program, they could say, look, let's disable the warheads now, because now it's clear that the Iranians will not stop till they get an atomic program. Let's blow up where we think the warheads are, bomb Iran hard now, bomb wherever they're researching the launcher program, bomb as many launchers as we can, bomb as many air defense systems as we can so the Iranians feel too vulnerable. And let's expand our bombing campaign past what we did before, because obviously striking the atomic weapons program wasn't enough. We need to disincentivize the Russians. And though it could be, hey, we have 5 atomic warheads, could be a moment where the American government doesn't say, oh, let's back off, but says, now we have to strike. We either do now or never, do or die, could be what they could be pushed into. Of course, it depends on the amount of warheads and if they have a delivery system, but that's something to consider. Point is, there's a lot of pitfalls, both for the Russians when it comes to their ongoing war and what this would mean for American artillery shipments to Ukraine, American air defense shipments for Ukraine, American intelligence shipment sharing for the Ukrainians, for the secondary sanctions bill, which already has 85 co-sponsors in the Senate, and Trump allowing that to go forward, and whether or not one phone call to Mike Johnson, that bill will get a vote within 72 hours, and it will pass the House and Senate with a veto-proof majority. Trump has to literally just say, I don't care anymore. They've pissed me off. Do it without me. He just has to sit back and watch it happen. That's without him preparing a new aid package, or more likely, preparing a new weapons deal, a weapons sale. Like the Ukrainians asking for that $15 billion worth of Patriot air defense systems. None of this is going to change the material reality of what America has in its reserves, but it could change Trump's thinking. And Trump was particularly willing to expend a lot of munitions to bomb the Houthis. A lot of munitions to bomb the Houthis, even though it didn't come with much success. And I hope one day we can do a segment on that, on the lack of success on the Houthi bombing campaign. I think it deserves some attention. But it got to the point where Asia Pacific Command was making comments about the fact that we were firing more missiles than we could replenish, more munitions than we could replenish from our current production numbers. And so we took a step back and we reeled it in. But it shows that Trump's willing to go out there and slug. And so that's something that should be considered. Either way, at the end of the day, this isn't Dmitry Medvedev. This is not Vladimir Putin. I would not be surprised that if this is coming out of the face of Dmitry Medvedev to shield this type of comment coming from Vladimir Putin, to anger Trump with Putin, to anger him more with those who have the most power within Putin's government, and then cause a response in Ukraine. And so this is to create the threat of Iran still having other means to continue their atomic weapons program, therefore negotiate with them, or therefore respect them in some manner. Do not completely violate their sovereignty willy-nilly, or you never know what might happen. But also, this isn't Putin saying it, so what you gonna do? It gives Trump enough, consideration to say, maybe there's another way. But Trump did respond to this. Trump did respond to Medvedev. Did I hear former President Medvedev from Russia casually throwing around the N-word? Parentheses nuclear. And saying that he and other countries would supply these warheads to Iran. Did he really say that? Or is it just a figment of my imagination? If he did say that, and if confirmed, please let me know immediately. The N-word should not be treated so casually. I guess that's why Putin's the boss. By the way, if anyone thinks our hardware was great over the weekend, far and away the strongest and best equipment we have, 20 years advanced over the pack, is our nuclear submarines. They are the most powerful. And now he's chest beating on atomic weapons. This is Trump chest beating on atomic weapons. He's reminding the Russians that we have an atomic triad. We have delivery by air, delivery by silo, delivery by sea. They are the most powerful and lethal weapons ever built, and just launched the 30 Tomahawks, and all 30 hit their marks perfectly. So, in addition to the great fighter pilots, thank you to the captain and crew.
A curd is a curd.
A squid eating dough in a polyethylene bag is fast and bulbous. Got me?
Thank you for the $5. I appreciate that. Fast and bulbous. Interesting name as ever. Longtime supporter of the channel. So, to me, this is Trump basically saying, what did you say you're going to do? What you're going to counteract what Trump is probably going to stomp around saying is the biggest foreign policy accomplishment of his administration. When Obama got to say the JCPOA was his biggest foreign policy accomplishment, Trump could now come out and say, we bombed the bomb out of Iran. He could not only is this a potential victory for Trump, but he still needs to get a long-term solution instead of just endlessly bombing them. This is something that he can directly hold over the legacy of Barack Obama. And I think that's something Trump really appreciates and does not want the Russians countering. And so there have been those within the Republican right who have been of the mind that, look, you got to confront Russia and Iran together. They're a joint threat. They support each other. And when this came out, those people got extra loud. Those like Lindsey Graham, Dan Crenshaw, and others who think that, confronting these people together because they support each other makes more sense because they're both combating against American interests. They are trying to use this cover to talk about it and push this point quite a bit. I think we might actually have Lindsey Graham's post here somewhere. Now that's a different post. One second. I don't have it pulled up, but Lindsey Graham's post essentially amounted to, "You're right, President Trump. Isn't President Trump so right on this, everybody? We do need to be strong against the Russians. And that's why I've introduced my sanctions bill, X, Y, and Z." So to me, this reads as Trump saying, really? I didn't hear that because you wouldn't say that. You wouldn't be so bold to throw around that type of action. Then he acknowledges that Medvedev isn't the boss. Putin's the boss. And I guess that's why Putin's the boss, essentially saying Putin is smart enough not to say this, right? And then goes on to some chest beating about our tomahawks and the fact that we have a nuclear triad. So Trump basically immediately taking this Medvedev idea, and before it even gets out of the mouth of Vladimir Putin, if he was even considering of saying that, taking it over his knee and snapping it and saying, "No, sirree, not allowed. You don't even talk about that." He didn't even mention any consequences. The only thing that could even be maybe suggested could be mentioned as consequences was the fact that he was talking later about how powerful their weapons are. So again, chest beating. The Russians so far have offered nothing but words. And when it was suggested by Medvedev they could offer something besides that, Trump was quick to come down and crash upon that. And considering that the Russians want to continue to drag out an American response, to delay an American response if they cannot stop it, them following up on this with some type of actual reciprocal action to support the Iranians with their atomic program might not be in their best interests when it comes to the wars that they're fighting. They're then again throwing this Russian strategic partnership with the Iranians into question. So I have an update on a story we talked about yesterday, and that had to do with how the Russians are dealing with the pressure that the Trump administration put on Iran. And after they struck the Iranian nuclear facilities at Isfahan and the other above ground one with 30 Tomahawk missiles and dropped the 30,000-pound bombs on the site at Fordow, the Russians responded essentially saying, after signing the strategic partnership with the Iranians, "Oh, look, guys, this is against the crime of aggression." Because the Russians, to be fair, would be experts in the crime of aggression. So I do trust them to know it when they see it. But they said it was a crime of aggression. It was so bad. And we're going to support Iran. And I mean, this even Peskov reinforced this. So this is the only support that they verbally confirmed, that they are going to condemn it and they are going to offer to mediate, which Trump famously responded to by saying, "I don't need you guys to mediate this war. I need you guys to mediate your own." So the second one, it wasn't even an option. And the first one, a condemnation, is really just going to get chuckles for most of the world community, considering who's making it, the Russians. So Medvedev needed to bring some other stuff to the table. And he said, the former president of Russia, head of the Russian Security Council, man all the way back from Putin's first electoral campaign, he said, wait, we'll be willing to support Iran's nuclear program, possibly. You never know who might give them some warheads. And so he was lightly suggesting, implicitly, that they might give Iran the technology or even the warheads necessary for their program. Trump then responded, basically giving him a tongue lashing, saying, "You would never undermine Putin because you guys know that the United States retains the ability with its big weapons and bombs. And basically, he was like, you aren't serious, because Putin's the one that really speaks on this. And you are Medvedev, and we have bombs. And this is now Medvedev's official response to that. Regarding President Trump's concerns, I condemned the U.S. strikes on Iran. It failed to achieve its objectives. However, Russia has no intention of supplying nuclear weapons to Iran because, unlike Israel, we are parties to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. I know quite well what this would entail, having overseen our nuclear forces as president. But other countries might, and that's what was said. And we definitely shouldn't be arguing over who has more nukes. All the more so because the new START treaty, which I once signed with the US president, is still in force for now. The question is, even though they pulled out of it, they just say that they're going to uphold its principles, but outside of its framework. The question is, what comes next? So basically, him suggesting that they might provide atomic warheads, he immediately walks that back, stands still on condemning the strikes, talks about, Israel not being a party to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty while holding atomic weapons, which is true, and then goes around for the comment on who knows what's next. This is Medvedev getting pushback from Trump and taking one step forward, two steps back. It is funny, I gotta say, at least to watch Medvedev have to reel himself in after either a totally sober or drunken stupor. Cuomo just conceded the election. Hey, where is the video?